The story of Joseph in the book of Genesis is universally praised by scholars as a masterpiece of literature. It combines a rag-to-riches plot with a tale of fraternal conflict in a way that engages the reader from start to finish. The self-contained narrative stands on its own, yet its position at the end of Genesis creates a bridge between two competing visions of Israel's past. The patriarchal tradition about how Abraham's family peacefully settled in Canaan, and the Exodus tradition in which Canaan was occupied through conquest. The Joseph story itself contains many riddles, as well as literary and historical connections that are often overlooked. Understanding some of these issues, including the puzzles that remain unsolved, can help us appreciate the story in new ways. The story begins in chapter 37. The patriarch Jacob has settled in Canaan, and Joseph is the most beloved of his 12 sons. Joseph's brothers hate him for this reason, and their hatred grows stronger after Joseph tells them about 2 dreams he has had. The first dream involves Joseph and his brothers. Joseph tells them, "There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly, my sheaf rose and stood upright. Then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." The brothers take this as a prediction that Joseph will reign over them. This appears to come true later in the story, when Joseph becomes vizier of Egypt and his brothers come to buy grain during a famine. The second dream is not as straightforward. Joseph tells his father and brothers, "Look, I have had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." This second dream appears to convey the same message as the first dream, but closer examination reveals some difficulties. Joseph's father takes the stars, sun, and moon to represent the 11 brothers and Joseph's parents bowing to Joseph, much like the sheaves. However, we must recall that Joseph's mother, Rachel, died giving birth to Benjamin 2 chapters earlier. She has no part in the Joseph story, and certainly does not bow down to Joseph at the end. Furthermore, it is Joseph who bows to his father later in the story. How do we explain these discrepancies? Perhaps the original story stood apart from Genesis and did not know about Rachel's death. When it was added to the Pentateuch, the ending had to be modified to accommodate these facts. This is the suggestion of Thomas L. Thompson, who writes, "Certainly the possibility arises that this dream once played its role in a significant variation of the Joseph story. That the dream has survived in the present story ought not to surprise us. The minor narrative discord that this dream brings with it pales in contrast to the striking imagery of the sun and the moon and all the stars bowing down before Joseph. Could any storyteller resist such magic for the sake of consistency?" Anyhow, one day Joseph is sent by his father from the valley of Hebron to check on his brothers who are tending their flocks in Shechem. This geography is problematic, and we'll revisit one of the issues later on. Joseph ends up finding his brothers at Dothan after an odd diversion in which a stranger gives Joseph directions. When the brothers see Joseph coming, they conspire to murder him. Exactly what happens next is unclear, however. Initially, Reuben comes to Joseph's rescue, insisting that he be thrown into a cistern Reuben has found, rather than being killed outright. "We must shed no blood," Reuben tells his brothers. "Lay no hand on him." What Reuben is suggesting is that they should murder Joseph indirectly, through starvation or perhaps drowning, instead of through direct violence. But Reuben's suggestion is a ruse, for he intends to return in secret later and rescue Joseph from the cistern. So the brothers carry out Reuben's suggestion. But afterward, as they sit down to eat, Judah sees a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead on their way to Egypt. He proposes selling Joseph instead of killing him, seemingly oblivious to the fact that Joseph has already been dealt with. Judah even makes the same argument as Reuben, that they should not lay their hands on Joseph, as if for the first time. Everyone agrees to Judah's new plan. And then, suddenly, some Midianite traders pass by, pull Joseph out of the cistern, and sell him to the Ishmaelites. And later, when Reuben returns to the cistern in secret, he is confused to find it empty. When verse 27 says that the brothers had agreed to Judah's plan, was Reuben not one of the brothers? In short, we seem to have 2 versions of the story mixed together, one in which Reuben saves Joseph's life, and one in which Judah does. one in which Midianites take Joseph and one in which Ishmaelites do. The contradictions in the final text are impossible to reconcile, and scholars don't all agree which version was original. Egyptologist Donald Redford, in his seminal study of the Joseph tale, raises numerous points in favor of the originality of the Reuben version, which is more internally consistent. The Judah version would have been added later to cast Judah in a better light. If we remove the Judah verses and some awkward foreshadowing that has been added by a redactor, we get a fully coherent and rather exciting first act. The brothers plan to murder Joseph. Reuben suggests that they instead abandon Joseph in a cistern. The brothers agree to his plan, stripping Joseph of his robe before throwing him in. Later, Midianite traders come to the cistern, presumably in search of water. They discover Joseph and take him as a slave, unbeknownst to the brothers. Reuben returns to the cistern in secret to rescue Joseph, but, to his dismay, finds him gone already. The brothers cover up Joseph's disappearance by soaking his robe in goat's blood so that Jacob will think an animal killed Joseph. Reuben goes along with his brother's cover-up, and Joseph ends up in Egypt unbeknownst to everyone. This version is most consistent with what happens later in the story, including the fact that it is Midianites rather than Ishmaelites who sell Joseph to Potiphar, the captain of the guard, in verse 36. Let's pause the story and examine Joseph's famous coat. There is a running theme that major moments in Joseph's life are marked by a change in garments. This theme begins with a special robe that Joseph's father makes for him in 37:3. The text calls it a ketonet pasim, which means... well, actually, no one knows what it means. A ketonet is an article of clothing, but pasim presents some difficulty. In modern Hebrew, pas means stripe, but in biblical Hebrew it meant extremity, border, or vanishing. Rabbinical commentators apparently imagined a light, delicate fabric. Modern translators often imagine a robe that extends to one's extremities, i.e., hands and feet. For example, the NRSV translation calls it a long robe with sleeves. The common conception that it was a coat of many colors, as the King James Version describes it, probably comes from the Greek translation of Genesis, in which it is called a chiton poikilon, or many-colored coat. That's probably incorrect. However, there's an interesting historical connection here. According to Dutch Old Testament scholar Jan Wim Vesalius, the story of Joseph is partially based on Herodotus's biography of Cyrus, who was raised in a shepherd's household, hidden from his family for years, and learned about his future through dreams. Cyrus too had a distinctive multicolored garment as a child, and that garment was used to fake his death. If Vesalius is correct, and the parallels are striking, then perhaps the Septuagint translator was aware of the connection and was guided by the Cyrus story when he described the robe as having many colors. There's also another biblical text to consider. A ketonet pasim is mentioned one other time in the Bible. In 2 Samuel 13, Tamar, the daughter of King David, is wearing one when she is raped by her half-brother Amnon. Now Tamar was wearing a ketonet pasim, for this is how the virgin daughters of the king were clothed in earlier times. Tamar put ashes on her head and tore the ketonet ha-pasim that she was wearing. According to the late theologian Theodore W. Jennings Jr., the parallels between Joseph and Tamar go beyond coincidence. The parallels in the garment episodes are quite striking. Both play a role in the distinguishing of the wearer. Both are worn by figures to whose beauty the reader is directed, and both wearers are assaulted by their brothers. Both garments become signs of mourning and violation. These multiple resonances of the long robe with sleeves prevent us from supposing that it is simply incidental that both Joseph and Tamar are depicted as wearing the same fashion statement. That leads us to a strange digression in chapter 38. This chapter is a self-contained passage about the life of Judah that is completely at odds with the Joseph story. Judah abandons his brothers and settles in the region of Canaan later associated with the tribe of Judah. He finds a wife and has 3 sons who eventually grow up to adulthood, Onan, and Shelah. Dies young, leaving his wife Tamar childless. Onan refuses to fulfill his duty of impregnating Tamar, which was her right by ancient custom, and is killed by Yahweh. Judah's own wife eventually dies. Judah refuses to let Shelah impregnate his daughter-in-law, so Tamar poses as a prostitute, sleeps with Judah himself, and bears twins. Then the story of Joseph resumes in chapter 39, and everything we have read about the life of Judah is forgotten. Once again, he is one of 11 brothers who live with their father in Beersheba. He doesn't even appear to have children, unlike his older brother Reuben. But what's also interesting is that this is the second time we've encountered the name Tamar in our investigation. Furthermore, both Tamars are the victims of sexual crimes at the hands of close relatives. Is that just a coincidence? Graham Auld, a leading authority on the books of Kings and Samuel, doesn't think so. Genesis 38 was no cuckoo intruded into the nest of the Joseph story, for both the Judah and Tamar story and the wider account of Joseph's sons were heavily indebted to the troubled stories of David's family. We should deduce that the books of Samuel were a resource, a spring, from which the authors of Genesis drew not once, but repeatedly. In other words, the Tamar of 2 Samuel and the betrayal she endured was a source of inspiration for the editors of Genesis, both in the clothing Joseph wore and in the name of the daughter-in-law whom Judah mistreated. Getting back to the main story, Genesis 37 verse 36 and 39 verse 1 tell us that Joseph was sold to an officer of Pharaoh named Potiphar, whose position was captain of the guard. Joseph soon gains his master's favor and is made the overseer of his household. Joseph's good looks catch the eye of his master's wife, and she attempts to seduce him day after day. One day, after tearing Joseph's garment off in a final attempt at seduction, she accuses him of attempted rape. Joseph is then thrown into the king's prison, and this is where things get confusing again. The prison is overseen by someone called the keeper of the prison in chapter 39. Joseph eventually gains the prison keeper's favor and is put in charge of all the prisoners, despite being one himself. A rather strange situation, to be frank. In chapter 40, Pharaoh becomes angry with his cupbearer and baker and has them confined in the house of the captain of the guard. Verse 3 tells us that this house is the prison where Joseph is also confined. Well, wait a second. So the prison where Joseph was sent also happens to be the house of the captain of the guard, his former master? Are we supposed to understand that the captain of the guard is the same person as the keeper of the prison? This makes little sense given the way the previous chapter unfolded. In the verses that follow, the two disgraced employees of the Pharaoh tell Joseph about the dreams they have had. Joseph, apparently now an expert on deciphering dreams, tells the cupbearer and the baker their fortunes. Nothing in this passage really suggests that Joseph is being held captive in a prison. The keeper of the prison is never mentioned again. Instead, text continues to tell us that these events occur at the house of the captain of the guard, Joseph's master. In chapter 41, Pharaoh has two troubling dreams that his magicians cannot interpret. The cupbearer, who has been restored to his position, remembers Joseph and tells Pharaoh about a Hebrew he met who deciphers dreams. He describes Joseph not as a prisoner but as a servant of the captain of the guard, where the cupbearer was confined. Joseph is summoned, and after he interprets Pharaoh's dreams, he is put in charge of Pharaoh's house. The story seems to have forgotten about Joseph's crime and incarceration. No pardon or release from prison is ever mentioned. Joseph's change in status is more like a job promotion. To summarize the problem, the text seems to contradict itself on whether Joseph is incarcerated in prison or remains a servant in his master's household, and on whether he answers to the keeper of the prison or the captain of the guard. Professors Donald Redford and Thomas Römer convincingly show that this passage has been altered by insertions. The important point is to understand that, in the original story, there was no subplot about Joseph being falsely accused and imprisoned. Joseph was simply the household overseer for his master, the captain of the guard. Pharaoh confined his out-of-favor officials in the house of Joseph's master, not in a prison. It should also be noted that prisons, in fact, probably did not exist in Egypt until Ptolemaic times. It makes perfect sense then that the detainees were put in Joseph's charge. A later writer added dramatic conflict by introducing the story of the seductress and Joseph's fall from grace. This addition might have been inspired by the Tale of Two Brothers, a well-known Egyptian folktale with a similar plot. There are also close similarities to the story of Ahikar, a popular ancient work that was first discovered at Elephantine in Egypt. Jean-Louis Ska notes that the prison subplot is incomplete from a narrative point of view. It is missing a satisfactory conclusion since Joseph is never actually vindicated, nor is his accuser ever brought to justice. A third writer, perhaps realizing that Yahweh's agency was absent throughout the entire Joseph story, added 2 short passages at the beginning and end of chapter 39. These 2 insertions clarify that Yahweh's blessing was responsible for Joseph's success at finding favor with his masters, and the second insertion introduces the keeper of the prison, who is mentioned nowhere else. Pharaoh's 2 dreams are recounted twice in chapter 41. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "In my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile, and 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. Then 7 other cows came up after them, poor, very ugly, and thin. Never had I seen such ugly ones in all the land of Egypt. The thin and ugly cows ate up the first 7 fat cows, but when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had done so, for they were still as ugly as before. Then I awoke, and I saw in my dream 7 ears of grain, full and good, growing on one stalk, and 7 ears withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprouting after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. But when I told it to the magicians, there was no one who could explain it to me." Joseph tells Pharaoh that the meaning of the 2 dreams is the same. There will be 7 years of plenty in Egypt, followed by 7 years of famine. Later in the chapter, we are told that the famine has affected the whole world, including Canaan. Redford points out that this expansion of the famine, though necessary as a plot device for bringing Joseph's family to Egypt, is not historically realistic, since what produces a famine in Egypt, namely the failure of the river to flood, does not have the same effect in Palestine. The first dream explicitly links the famine to the Nile River. Historically, Egypt's farmland was irrigated by the annual flooding of the Nile. If weather conditions upstream disrupted that flooding, the annual harvest would be poor and famine would result. The symbolism of the second dream is somewhat less clear. The Kadim, or east wind that makes the grain wither, is a hot, dry wind that blows in Palestine, not Egypt. It's also harder to imagine ears of grain eating each other since, unlike cows, they do not have mouths. Redford believes the second dream may have been inserted later. This is suggested by the rough transition in verses 21 and 22, in which Pharaoh awakes from the first dream and then has the second dream with no mention of going back to sleep. Perhaps the second dream was for the benefit of readers who understood drought conditions in Palestine, but not the Nile's flooding cycle. We've established that an Egyptian famine resulting from the failure of the Nile to flood would not affect crops in Canaan or the rest of the Mediterranean. Furthermore, the recurring motif of 7 years signals that the story belongs in the realm of the storyteller rather than historical reality. Sagan calls it a fairy tale motif. Interestingly, the ancient Egyptians had their own myths about 7-year famines. The most famous is preserved in an inscription on a monument located near Elephantine on the Nile River. This monument, known as the Famine Stele, tells the story of a famine that afflicted Egypt for 7 years during the reign of the pharaoh Djoser. In that story, Djoser asks his vizier, a priest named Imhotep, for advice. Imhotep investigates and discovers that the flooding of the Nile is controlled by the god Khnum at Elephantine. The pharaoh then travels to the temple of Khnum, where he purifies himself and offers sacrifices. Afterward, the god Khnum appears to him in a dream and promises to flood the Nile again. Upon waking, the pharaoh issues a decree granting to the temple and its priests the rights to a large stretch of farmland. According to scholars, this story was a pious fraud about the past that was meant to promote the interests of the Khnum priesthood. The similarities to the Joseph story are immediately apparent. The 7-year famine, the role of dreams, and the intervention of the king's vizier all have corresponding elements in the biblical story. Although this fictitious tale is set during the time of Djoser, who reigned in the 27th century BCE, the inscription itself dates to the Ptolemaic period, perhaps the reign of Ptolemy V. The pharaoh Djoser was famous for building the first Egyptian pyramid, and his vizier Imhotep was possibly even more famous. In addition to being the high priest, Imhotep oversaw all stone building projects, including that of Djoser's tomb. Long after his death, Imhotep came to be regarded as a legendary writer of wisdom texts, a healer, a magician, and even a deity. Other examples of the 7-year famine motif and the dream motif in Egyptian storytelling exist as well. A religious text known as the Book of the Temple, which dates to the 4th or 5th century BCE, describes a 7-year famine during the reign of an obscure king named Neferkasokar. In this text, the king has a dream in which he is instructed to appoint a supervisor who will restore the Egyptian temples. After this has been done, the normal flow of the Nile resumes. Egyptologist Joachim Kavak has also described an unpublished papyrus, known as BM 10565, that again features the priest Imhotep in a tale about 7 years of good harvests, followed by 7 years of famine. The text is too fragmentary, unfortunately, to reconstruct the entire story. In summary, we have evidence for an Egyptian myth genre, widespread in the Ptolemaic period, about an ancient 7-year famine that involved dreams, the Nile River, a wise overseer, and the Egyptian temples. The possibility that the Israelite scribe who wrote the original story of Joseph was familiar with one or more of these Egyptian tales must be taken seriously. But this raises further questions. When was the Joseph story written, and where would Israelites have been exposed to these Egyptian legends? Why was the Joseph story even written in the first place? Now, I mentioned earlier that the famine stele was erected near Elephantine and was associated with the temple of the crater god Khnum, which was also located at Elephantine. Elephantine is an island on the Nile River in a place called Aswan, near the southern border between Egypt and Nubia. The Egyptians believed that the waters of the Nile River originated here, and that Khnum was their protector. Thus, the fertility of the Nile was directly associated with Elephantine. During the late period and Ptolemaic period, Elephantine was also home to a military garrison established by Pharaoh Psamtik I. What's also interesting is that this garrison included a community of Judean, Israelite, and Aramean mercenaries and their families who had lived there since the Persian era, and its numerous temples included a temple to Yahweh. We know all this from a cache of 5th century letters and legal documents discovered at the site, documents written in Aramaic by and for the Israelites on the island. In other words, on one hand, there was a vibrant Jewish diaspora living in Egypt in a location specifically associated with a well-known Egyptian famine legend and during the same time period. And on the other hand, we have a Jewish story about Israelites making a life for themselves in Egypt, featuring distinctive elements that also appear in the Egyptian story: the wise vizier, the pharaoh's dreams, and the 7-year famine. There's another connection I'll get to in a moment. That doesn't mean, of course, that the Joseph story was written in Elephantine. However, it suggests that those who wrote and revised it were connected with the Egyptian diaspora and intentionally used Egyptian literary traditions. Let's return once more to the biblical story. Pharaoh recognizes the wisdom of Joseph and puts him in authority over all of Egypt. Joseph is given an Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah, and he marries Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On. During the next 7 years, Joseph stores up grain throughout Egypt. Then, as predicted, the 7 years of famine come. Back in Canaan, which also suffers from famine, Joseph's father decides to send all his sons except Benjamin to Egypt to buy grain. According to chapter 42, verse 6, Joseph personally handles the selling of grain to both Egyptians and foreigners. Thus, his brothers come directly to him upon arrival, bowing down and fulfilling the dream about the sheaves. They do not recognize Joseph, so he decides to test them. He tests their loyalty to each other by detaining Simeon while the rest are sent home to fetch Benjamin. He tests their honesty by hiding money in their grain sacks. And he tests their loyalty to their youngest brother by hiding his cup in Benjamin's sack. Eventually, Joseph reveals his identity and is reunited with his brothers and father, who all move to Egypt and settle in the land of Goshen. Scholars have identified several expansions and revisions in the story that I won't get into here. However, chapter 47 contains a strange passage that warrants examination. Seemingly after the story is over, the famine crisis averted, Joseph's family reunited, etc., chapter 47 gives us an odd flashback that feels like an alternate version of the story. It begins by reminding us, "Now there was no food in all the land, for the famine was very severe. The land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine." This famine sends Joseph into action. First, he collects all the money in Egypt and Canaan in exchange for grain. Then, with the people still starving, Joseph trades them more grain in exchange for all the horses, sheep, cattle, and donkeys in Egypt. The famine continues the next year, so Joseph gives the people more grain in return for their land and their servitude as slaves. However, Joseph makes an exception for Egyptian priests. Only the land of the priests did he not buy, for the priests had a fixed allowance from Pharaoh and lived on the allowance that Pharaoh gave them. Therefore, they did not sell their land. At the end of the famine, Joseph enacts a law that henceforth all the people except the priests must give 1/5 of their harvests to the Pharaoh. Redford calls this passage a fascinating etiological story which describes how all the land of Egypt came to be the possession of Pharaoh. But does it describe actual historical events? The organization of farmland into estates belonging to the Pharaoh and managed by the nobility is generally attributed to Pharaoh Djoser. And this situation persisted all the way into Ptolemaic times. However, Egyptian temples were not exempt from taxes until the 26th dynasty, so this story best correlates to the later history of Egypt from the 7th century BCE onward. It should also be noted that the special exemption for temples in the biblical story parallels the special favors for temples that featured in the famine myths of the famine stele and the Book of the Temple. Now, verse 21 makes the odd claim that Joseph was responsible for moving the population of Egypt into cities. This might reflect the urbanization efforts of the Ptolemaic dynasty. In historical terms, all these political developments cannot be credited to any single individual. However, Joseph's actions are reminiscent of those taken by Cleomenes of Naucratis. Cleomenes was appointed governor and put in charge of Egypt's finances by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE. He also took control over grain exports during a famine that occurred a few years later, and sold grain back to the Egyptians at an exorbitant markup. His actions also apparently led to a financial dispute with the temple priests that was eventually resolved in the priests' favor. Furthermore, Cleomenes was the one who spearheaded the development of the city of Alexandria, and within a century it would become the largest urban center in the world. If, as some scholars think, this chapter about Joseph's canny financial dealings was a late addition to the Joseph story, perhaps the real-life activities of Cleomenes were recent enough to influence the author's portrayal of Joseph.
Many of them have no money left to buy food. Those that have cattle pay with cattle. Those that have land with their land.
According to the final verses of chapter 50, Joseph lives a long life and dies at the age of 110. According to an oft-cited study by J.M.A. Janssen, 110 years was regarded by Egyptians as the ideal lifespan. There are at least 27 known references to reaching the age of 110, or desiring to do so, in Egyptian texts and inscriptions. After his death, Joseph is embalmed and placed in a coffin, seemingly in the manner of high-ranking Egyptian officials. No one else in the Bible is ever described as being placed in a coffin. If we look at the tale of Joseph as a standalone story, what is its genre? What is its message? And who was its audience? Many of the historical connections described so far suggest that the story in its final form should be dated to the Egyptian late period or even the Ptolemaic period. There are many other anachronisms in the story that imply such a dating. To give a few examples, according to Redford, the products carried by the Ishmaelites, gum, balm, and myrrh, are mentioned in texts of the Ptolemaic period and not earlier. Ishmaelites only appear in late Old Testament books like Judith, Chronicles, and Psalms. They and similar nomads inhabited the Negev after Judah as a kingdom ceased to exist. It is only in the late period that we have evidence for an international slave trade. Palestine only came to be called the land of the Hebrews in the late period. The cow hieroglyph was sometimes used to write the word year in the Ptolemaic period, but not earlier as far as our evidence shows. The term overseer, Pekadim, used in Genesis 41:34, gained its technical meaning around the 5th century. The 3 Egyptian names that appear in the story best fit the late period. The Ishmaelites used camels to carry their wares to Egypt, but the domestication of camels and their use by nomads didn't occur until around the 9th century. Egyptologist Camille Guérin further notes that domesticated camels were not introduced to Egypt until Ptolemaic times. In earlier times, donkeys are constantly mentioned in connection with trade, but never camels. Joseph's actions that enslaved the Egyptian peasants to the pharaoh best reflect the situation in the cited period and later. The virtually complete silence of the rest of the scripture on the Joseph story strongly suggests that the narrative did not exist when the historical and prophetic books were written. J.A. Sagan adds a few more reasons. Several Akkadian loanwords in the story suggest influence from the Babylonian exile. The toponyms of Goshen and On, which is equated with Heliopolis, are both contemporary to the Hellenistic period. And remember how the story begins with Joseph departing from the Valley of Hebron? According to Thomas Römer, Iron Age Hebron was not in a valley, it was situated on a mountain. The site today is called Tel Rumeida. However, ancient Hebron was abandoned during the Persian period, and a new settlement called Hebron was established in the Hellenistic period in a nearby valley, Wadi el-Halil. Römer also notes that the narrator never describes any divine intervention, unlike most other stories in Genesis. This makes the story similar to other late novellas like Esther, in which God's agency is left up to the reader's interpretation. Scholars increasingly regard the Joseph story as a diaspora novella, a story written by and for Jews who had made a new life for themselves outside of Palestine. Despite the hardships they faced, the Jewish diaspora thrived in Egypt and elsewhere outside their homeland, just as they do today, several millennia later. Joseph's story was written in part to assure them that everything was in God's control and would turn out for the best. This message is particularly explicit in Genesis 45 verses 5 and 8, as well as Genesis 50:19. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended it for good, in order to preserve a numerous people as he is doing today. Not only does Joseph thrive in Egypt, but he does so by climbing the ranks of Egyptian society, adopting the Egyptian language, taking an Egyptian name, marrying an Egyptian woman, and being embalmed in the Egyptian manner. It provides a view of the Jewish people and their place in the world that is remarkably different from the views of other biblical authors. Historically speaking, who is Joseph? In the story, we find close parallels with Cyrus of Persia, the wise vizier Imhotep, Cleomenes of Naucratis, Bada from the Tale of Two Brothers, and Ahikar, among others. But the real answer is in the name. Long before the story of 12 brothers named for the tribes of Israel took form, the name Joseph was associated with the land of Israel. In a sense, Joseph is Israel, and he represents the collective experiences of the Israelite people outside of Palestine. Thanks for watching.
I look handsome, I look smart, I am a walking work of art. Such a dazzling coat of many colors, how I love my coat of many colors.
It was red and yellow and green and brown and scarlet and black and ochre and peach and ruby and olive and violet.
And yellow and green and brown and scarlet and black and ochre and peach and ruby.